Imageology. The politician is dependent on the journalist, but on whom are the journalists dependent? On those who pay them. And those who pay them are the advertising agencies that buy space from newspapers and time from radio and TV stations. At first glance, it may seem that the agencies would unhesitatingly approach all the high circulation newspapers capable of increasing the sale of their products, but that's a naive view of the matter. Sales of products are less important than we think. Just look at the communist countries. The millions of pictures of Lenin displayed everywhere you go certainly do not stimulate love for Lenin. The advertising agencies of the Communist Party, the so-called agitprop departments, have long forgotten the practical goal of their activity, to make the communist system better liked, and have become an end in themselves. They have created their own language, their formulas, their aesthetics. The heads of these agencies once had absolute power over art in their countries. Their idea of the right lifestyle, which they cultivate, disseminate, and force upon their unfortunate peoples. Are you objecting that advertising and propaganda cannot be compared because one serves commerce and the other ideology? You understand nothing. Some 100 years ago in Russia, persecuted Marxists began to gather secretly in small circles in order to study Marx's manifesto. They simplified the contents of this simple ideology in order to disseminate it to other circles, whose members, simplifying further and further this simplification of the simple, kept passing it on and on, so that when Marxism became known and powerful on the whole planet, all that was left of it was a collection of 6 or 7 slogans so poorly linked that it can hardly be called an ideology. And precisely because the remnants of Marx no longer form any logical system of ideas, but only a series of suggestive images and slogans: a smiling worker with a hammer, black, white, and yellow men fraternally holding hands, the dove of peace rising to the sky, and so on and so on. We can rightfully talk of a gradual, general, planetary transformation of ideology into imageology. Imageology. Who first thought up this remarkable neologism? God, I just learned how to pronounce that. Neologism? Neologism? I can't remember. It means a new word. I know that. Imageology. Who first thought up this remarkable neologism? Paul or I? It doesn't matter. What matters is that this word finally lets us put under one roof something that goes by so many names: advertising agencies, political campaign managers, designers who devise the shape of everything from cars to gym equipment, fashion stylists, barbers, show business stars dictating the norms of physical beauty that all branches of imageology obey. Of course, imageologues existed long before they created the powerful institutions we know today. Even Hitler had his personal imageologue, who used to stand in front of him and patiently demonstrate the gestures to be made during speeches so as to fascinate the crowds. But if that imageologue, in an interview with the press, had amused the Germans by describing Hitler as incapable of moving his hands, he would not have survived his indiscretion by more than a few hours. Nowadays, however, the imageologue not only does not try to hide his activity, but often even speaks for his politician clients, explains to the public what he taught them to do or not to do, how he told them to behave, what formula they are likely to use, and what tie they are likely to wear. We needn't be surprised by this self-confidence. In the last few decades, imageology has gained a historic victory over ideology. All ideologies have been defeated. In the end, their dogmas were unmasked as illusions, and people stopped taking them seriously. For example, communists used to believe that in the course of capitalist development, the proletariat would gradually grow poorer and poorer. But when it finally became clear that all over Europe workers were driving to work in their own cars, they felt like shouting that reality was deceiving them. Reality was stronger than ideology. And it is in this sense that imageology surpassed it. Imageology is stronger than reality. which has anyway long ceased to be what it was for my grandmother, who lived in a Moravian village and still knew everything through her own experience: how bread is baked, how a house is built, how a pig is slaughtered and the meat smoked, what quilts are made of, what the priest and the school teacher think about the world. She met the whole village every day and knew how many murders were committed in the country over the last 10 years. She had, so to speak, personal control over reality. And nobody could fool her by maintaining that Moravian agriculture was thriving when people at home had nothing to eat. My Paris neighbor spends his time in an office, where he sits for 8 hours facing an office colleague. Then he sits in his car and drives home, turns on the TV, and when the announcer informs him that in the latest public opinion poll, the majority of Frenchmen voted their country the safest in Europe — I recently read such a report — he is overjoyed and opens a bottle of champagne without ever learning that 3 thefts and 2 murders were committed on his street that very day. Public opinion polls are the critical instrument of imageology's power because they enable imageology to live in absolute harmony with the people. The imageologue bombards people with questions. How is the French economy prospering? Is there racism in France? Is racism good or bad? Who is the greatest writer of all time? Is Hungary in Europe or in Polynesia? Which world politician is the sexiest? And since for contemporary man reality is a continent visited less and less often, and besides justifiably disliked, the findings of polls have become a kind of higher reality. Or to put it differently, they have become the truth. Public opinion polls are a parliament in permanent session. Wow, that was an alliterative sentence. Let's do it again. Public opinion polls are a parliament in permanent session, whose function it is to create truth, the most democratic truth that has ever existed, because it will never be at variance with the parliament of the truth. The power of imageologues will always live in truth. And although I know that everything human is mortal, I cannot imagine anything that could break this power. I want to add this comparison of ideology and imageology. Ideology was like a set of enormous wheels at the back of the stage, turning and setting in motion wars, revolutions, reforms. The wheels of imageology turn without having any effect upon history. Ideologies fought with one another, and each of them was capable of filling a whole epoch with its thinking. Imageology organizes peaceful alternation of its systems in lively seasonal rhythms. In Paul's words, ideology belonged to history, while the reign of imageology begins where history ends. The word change, so dear to our Europe, has been given a new meaning. It no longer means a new stage of coherent development, as it was understood by Vico, Hegel, or Marx, but a shift from one side to another, from front to back, from the back to the left, from the left to the front, as understood by designers dreaming up the fashion for the next season. Imageologues decided that in Agnes's health club, all the walls should be covered by enormous mirrors. This was not done because gymnasts needed to observe themselves while exercising, but because on the roulette wheel of imageology, mirrors had landed on a lucky number. If at the time I was writing these pages, everyone decided that Martin Heidegger was to be considered a bungler and a bastard, it was not because his thought had been surpassed by other philosophers, but because on the roulette wheel of imageology, this time he had landed on an unlucky number, an anti-ideal. Imageologues create systems of ideals and anti-ideals, systems of short duration that are quickly replaced by other systems, but that influence our behavior, our political opinions, and aesthetic tastes, the color of carpets and the selection of books, just as in the past we've been ruled by the systems of ideologues. After these remarks, I can return to the beginning of the discussion. The politician is dependent on the journalist. On whom are the journalists dependent? On imagologues. The imagologue is a person of conviction and principle. He demands of the journalist that his newspaper or TV channel, radio station, reflect the imagological system of a given moment. And this is what imagologues check from time to time when they are trying to decide which newspaper to support. One day they turned their attention to the radio station where Bernard worked as a commentator and where every Saturday Paul broadcast his brief feature, Rights in the Law. They promised to obtain many advertising contracts for the station as well as to launch a poster campaign all over France, but they insisted on certain conditions, to which the program director, known as the Bear, was forced to submit. He gradually began to shorten the commentaries so that the listeners would not be bored by long discussions. He allowed the commentators' 5-minute monologues to be interrupted by the questions of another broadcaster in order to give the impression of conversation. He added many more musical interludes, frequently even inserting background music under the words, and he advised everyone talking into a microphone to put on a relaxed, youthful, carefree air, an air that fills my morning dreams with bliss and turns weather reports into comic operas. Because he considered it important that his subordinates should continue to see him as a powerful bear. He tried as hard as he could to safeguard the jobs of all his fellow workers. He surrendered on only one point. The imagologues found Rights in the Law so obviously boring that they merely showed their excessively white teeth and refused to discuss it. The Bear promised to cancel the feature, and then he became ashamed of his surrender. He was all the more ashamed because Paul was his friend. The brilliant ally of his own gravediggers. The program director was called the Bear because that was the only possible name for him. Look at this shit. I don't think I've ever thought of this before, but it's exactly like fucking Gogol. I'm just thinking of this shit. Gogol's character, Sobkevich, who was utterly bear-like. It's hilarious. Sorry, we continue. The program director was called the Bear because that was the only possible name for him. He was stocky, slow, and though he was good-natured, everyone knew that his huge paw could pack quite a blow when he got angry. The imagologues who had the temerity to instruct him how to do his work all but drained the last drops of his bearish goodness. He sat in the studio cafeteria, surrounded by a few colleagues, and said, quote, "Those ad agency swindlers are like Martians. They don't behave like normal people. When they say the most unpleasant things to your face, they have a gleam in their eyes. Their vocabulary is limited to fewer than 50 words, and their sentences mustn't contain more than 4 words each. Their speech is a combination of 3 technical terms I don't understand, and of 1 or 2 breathtakingly banal ideas. These people aren't ashamed of being themselves, and haven't the slightest inferiority complex, and that is precisely the proof of their power." At this point, Paul appeared in the cafeteria. When they saw him, everyone became embarrassed, all the more so because Paul seemed to be in an excellent mood. He picked up a cup of coffee and joined the others at the table. The Bear felt uneasy in Paul's presence. He was ashamed of having thrown him to the wolves and of not having the courage now to tell him to his face. He was seized by a new wave of hatred for the imagologues and said, "I'd be willing, when it comes to it, to give in to those cretins and change the weather reports into a dialogue between clowns. The trouble is that right after that, Bernard might talk of a plane crash in which 100 passengers died. I may be willing to sacrifice my life to amuse my fellow Frenchmen, but news reports are no laughing matter. They all looked as if they agreed, except for Paul. He laughed the laugh of a joyous provocateur and said, "My dear Bear, the imagologues are right. You confuse news with school teaching." The Bear recalled that while Paul's commentaries were sometimes quite witty, they were generally too complex and also full of unusual words that the whole staff would afterwards secretly look up in the dictionary. But he didn't feel like mentioning this now and said with great dignity, "I always had a high opinion of journalism and I don't want to lose it." Paul said, "Listening to a news broadcast is like smoking a cigarette and crushing the butt in the ashtray." The Bear said, "That's just what I find so hard to accept." Paul laughed. "But you are an inveterate smoker. So why do you mind that news reports are like cigarettes? Cigarettes are bad for your health, whereas the news does you no harm, and is even a pleasant diversion before the start of a long day." The Bear asked, "The war between Iran and Iraq is diverting?" And his compassion for Paul was slowly becoming mixed with irritation. "Today's disasters, that railway accident, you find them amusing? You make a common error. Namely, considering death a tragedy," said Paul, and it was evident that he had got up that day in an excellent form. "I must admit," the Bear said in an icy voice, "that I have indeed always considered death a tragedy." "And you were wrong," said Paul. "A railway accident is horrible for somebody who was on the train or who had a son there, but in news reports, death means exactly the same thing as in the novels of Agatha Christie, who incidentally was the greatest magician of all time because she knew how to turn murder into amusement. And not just one murder, but dozens of murders, hundreds of murders. An assembly line of murders performed for our pleasure in the extermination camp of her novels. Auschwitz is forgotten, but from the crematorium of Agatha's novels, the smoke is forever rising into the sky, and only a very naive person could maintain that it is the smoke of tragedy." The Bear remembered that it was precisely with this kind of paradox that Paul had long been influencing his colleagues in the newsroom, and so it was that when the staff came under the critical scrutiny of the imagologues, they were of little help to their chief, the Bear, for deep in their hearts, they all considered his attitude passé. The Bear was ashamed of having submitted in the end, yet he knew he had no other choice. Such forced compromises with the spirit of the times, though quite banal, are actually inevitable unless we are ready to ask everyone who doesn't like our century to join in a general strike. In Paul's case, however, it was impossible to speak of a forced compromise. He was eager to put his wit and his intellect at the service of his century quite voluntarily and, to the Bear's taste, much too fervently. That's why he answered in a voice still icier. "I too read Agatha Christie, when I am tired, when I feel like turning into a child for a while. But if all our lives turned into child's play, then one day the world will die to the sound of childish prattle and laughter." Paul said, "I'd prefer to die to the sound of childish laughter than to the sound of Chopin's funeral march. And let me tell you this, all the evil in the world is in that funeral march, which is a glorification of death. If there were fewer funeral marches, there might perhaps be fewer deaths. Understand what I'm trying to say. Respect for tragedy is much more dangerous than the thoughtlessness of childish prattle. Do you realize what is the eternal precondition of tragedy? The existence of ideals that are considered more valuable than human life. And what is the precondition of wars? The same thing. They drive you to your death because presumably there is something greater than your life. We can only exist in a world of tragedy. From the beginning of history, man has known only a tragic world and has not been capable of stepping out of it. The age of tragedy can be ended only by the revolt of frivolity. Nowadays, people no longer know Beethoven's Ninth from concerts, but from 4 lines of the Ode to Joy that they hear every day in the ad for Bella perfume. That doesn't shock me. Tragedy will be driven from the world like a ludicrous old actress clutching her heart and declaiming in a hoarse voice. Frivolity is a radical diet for weight reduction. Things will lose 90% of their meaning and will become light. In such a weightless environment, fanaticism will disappear. War will become impossible. I am glad that you have finally found a way to eliminate war, said the bear. Can you imagine today's French youth rushing fervently to fight for their country? My dear bear, in Europe, war has become unthinkable. Not politically, anthropologically unthinkable. European people are no longer capable of waging war. Don't tell me that 2 men who deeply disagree with each other can still like each other. That's a fairy tale. Perhaps they would like each other if they kept their opinions to themselves, or if they only discussed them in a joking way and thus played down their significance. This indeed was the way Paul and the bear had always spoken to each other until now. But once a quarrel breaks out, it's too late, not because they believe so firmly in the opinions they defend, but because they can't stand not to be right. Look at those 2. After all, their dispute won't change anything. It will lead to no decision. It will not influence the course of events in the slightest. It is quite sterile and unnecessary. Confined to the cafeteria and its stale air, soon gone when the cleaning lady opens the windows. And yet observe the rapt attention of the small audience around the table. Everyone is quiet, listening intently. They even forget to sip their coffee. The 2 rivals now care only about one thing: which of them will be recognized by the opinion of this small audience of the possessor of the truth. For to be proved wrong means for each of them the same thing as losing his honor, or losing a piece of his own self. The opinion they advocate is itself not all that important to them, but because once they have made this opinion an attribute of their self, attacking it is like stabbing a part of their body. Somewhere in the depths of his soul, the bear felt satisfaction that Paul would no longer be presenting his sophisticated commentaries. His voice, full of bearish pride, was getting ever quieter and icier. Paul, on the other hand, kept talking louder and louder, and his ideas were getting more and more exaggerated and provocative. He said, quote, "High culture is nothing but a child of that European perversion called history. The obsession we have with going forward, with considering the sequence of generations as a relay race in which everyone surpasses his predecessor, only to be surpassed by his successor. Without this relay race called history, there would be no European art in what characterizes it. A longing for originality, a longing for change. Robespierre, Napoleon, Beethoven, Stalin, Picasso, they're all runners in the relay race. They all belong in the same stadium." "Beethoven and Stalin belong together?" asked the bear with icy irony. "Of course, no matter how much that may shock you, war and culture, those are the 2 poles of Europe, her heaven and hell, her glory and shame, and they cannot be separated from each other. When one comes to an end, the other will end also, and one cannot end without the other. The fact that no war has broken out in Europe for 50 years is connected in some mysterious way with the fact that for 50 years now, no new Picasso has appeared either. Let me tell you something, Paul," the bear said in a slow voice, as if he were lifting his heavy paw for a shattering blow. "If high culture is coming to an end, it is also the end of you and your paradoxical ideas, because paradox as such belongs to high culture and not to childish prattle. You remind me of the young men who supported the Nazis or communists not out of cowardice or out of opportunism, but out of an excess of intelligence. For nothing requires a greater effort of thought than arguments to justify the rule of non-thought. I experienced it with my own eyes and ears after the war, when intellectuals and artists rushed like a herd of cattle into the Communist Party, which soon proceeded to liquidate them systematically and with great pleasure. You are doing the same. You are the brilliant ally of your own gravediggers.